Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into the distant echoes of Byzantium, into those shadowed corners of history where spectacle and suffering intertwined in ways that still whisper to us across the centuries. My voice will be your companion as we wander through marble corridors and sand-strewn arenas, through moments both terrible and strangely human. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? I'm here in a quiet room where the clock has just passed 1 in the morning, and outside my window, the world has settled into that deep, peaceful silence that comes only when most souls have surrendered to sleep. Now, let me ask you to do something for yourself. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Let the glow around you soften into something like candlelight, something that might have flickered in a Byzantine palace on a winter evening. Rest your head on your pillow. Adjust it just so, until your neck releases all its tension. Pull your blanket a little higher, letting it cocoon you in warmth. And allow your breathing to soften, to deepen, to find its own gentle rhythm like waves lapping at a distant shore. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, if my voice becomes a thread guiding you toward rest, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. There's no urgency here, no pressure. We have all the time in the world, or perhaps no time at all, suspended as we are between waking and dreaming. Let us begin. Let me share with you the story of how entertainment became something darker in the great city of Constantinople. Sometime in the early 6th century, when the Roman Empire had transformed itself into something new, something we now call Byzantine. The Hippodrome stood at the heart of the city like a massive stone ship, its curved walls rising 3 stories high, capable of holding nearly 100,000 souls who came to watch chariots race around the central spine, that long marble barrier decorated with Egyptian obelisks and bronze serpents that had been ancient even then. Imagine the gentle scent of roasted chestnuts drifting up from the vendors' stalls. In those days, Byzantines loved a particular sweet called lucumia, what we might recognize today as an ancestor of Turkish delight, though calling it that would have confused them terribly. These were small cubes of rosewater-flavored gel, dusted with powdered sugar, sticky on the fingers, melting on the tongue. A street vendor named Georgios, who kept a stall near the Hippodrome's southern entrance, would prepare them fresh each morning, boiling down honey and cornstarch in a copper pot that had belonged to his grandmother. The year was 532, and Georgios had no idea that within a week, his city would erupt in violence that would leave 30,000 dead in what history remembers as the Nika riots. But before that conflagration, there were smaller cruelties, quieter moments of brutality that prepared the ground. You see, the Hippodrome had always been about more than chariot racing. Between races, during those long afternoon hours when the sun beat down on the sand and the crowd grew restless, the organizers needed to provide what they called intermissions, though that word hardly captures what they were. Picture a man named Theodore standing at the edge of the arena floor in the year 520, 12 years before those riots. He was a criminal, convicted of theft, Specifically, he had stolen a silver chalice from a church, melted it down, and tried to sell the metal to a jeweler who happened to be the bishop's cousin. Bad luck. Really, the kind of coincidence that changes everything. Theodore was 32 years old, a former baker who made these wonderful savory pastries filled with minced lamb and pine nuts, wrapped in thin layers of dough that shattered when you bit into them. His wife had left him the year before, taking their daughter to live with her parents in Antioch, and Theodore had fallen into wine and poor decisions. Now he stood in the arena wearing nothing but a loincloth, his hands bound behind his back, while 50,000 people watched from the stands. The sound was like being inside a beehive, a constant buzzing hum of conversation and expectation. A gate opened on the far side, and 3 dogs emerged, not ordinary dogs, but mastiffs that had been starved for 2 days and trained to attack on command. This was the punishment for sacrilege, for stealing from the church, and the crowd had paid good money to watch divine justice enacted in real time. There's something comfortingly distant about this part of the story, how removed it feels from our own lives, and yet, Theodore was a person who had liked a particular kind of unusual snack, a delicacy called garum mixed with honey and spread on bread. Garum was fermented fish sauce, pungent and salty, and mixing it with honey sounds terrible until you taste it, or so the ancient sources insist. The combination of salt and sweet, umami and floral, was considered sophisticated in the 6th century. Theodore had eaten it for breakfast on the morning of his arrest, dipping pieces of bread into a small ceramic bowl, sitting in the weak winter sunlight that came through his workshop window. The dogs reached him in seconds. The crowd's buzz became a roar. What the official records don't tell you, but what survives in a merchant's diary from that period, is that Theodore didn't scream. He stood very still, as if he had decided to absent himself from his own body, to leave before the pain arrived. The attack lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though time is strange in such moments. It can stretch like warm honey or snap like a dry twig. When it was over, slaves came with rakes to smooth the sand, and the crowd settled back into its buzzing anticipation of the next chariot race. The practice had not always been this way. In the earlier Roman period, around the year 200, criminals were sometimes given weapons and a fighting chance. There was cruelty, yes, but also the possibility of survival, of earning one's freedom through courage or luck or sheer bloody-minded determination. But by the time Byzantium had fully emerged from Rome's chrysalis, around the year 500, something had shifted. The emperors wanted to demonstrate absolute power, and absolute power requires examples that brook no ambiguity. Emperor Anastasius, who ruled from 491 to 518, was particularly fond of these spectacles. He was an odd man, Anastasius. He had a different colored pupil in each eye, one black and one partially blue, which his subjects found either fascinating or deeply unsettling depending on their temperament. He liked to eat quince paste, a sweet jelly made from cooked quinces that had the texture of very firm honey and tasted like autumn itself, like falling leaves and cool morning air. He would sit in the kathisma, the imperial box that jutted out over the hippodrome stands, eating small cubes of this quince paste from a silver plate while watching criminals face wild animals below. Historical records from 512 mention that Anastasius ordered 43 such executions in a single month, most of them during the intermissions of regular chariot races. The charges varied: theft, assault, heresy, blasphemy, but the outcome was always the same. Sometimes it was dogs, sometimes bears, brought down from the mountains of Thrace in wooden cages that groaned and creaked as ox carts hauled them through the city streets. Once, according to a letter preserved in a monastery archive, they used a lion that had been imported at enormous expense from North Africa, though the lion, perhaps confused by the noise and the heat, simply lay down in the sand and refused to participate in its assigned role, which caused considerable embarrassment all around. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting in its absurdity. After the lion incident, Anastasius issued a decree that all animals used for executions must be tested first in smaller, private arenas to ensure they would perform appropriately when the moment came. This led to the bizarre profession of beast inspector, men who would spend their days deliberately enraging animals to verify their aggression levels. It paid well, apparently, though the turnover rate was understandably high. As your breathing grows slower, as your body sinks deeper into your bed, consider how strange it is that these moments of terrible violence were punctuated by the most ordinary things: the smell of food cooking, the taste of honey, the complaint of a merchant about his taxes. A man named Cosmas, who sold savory pies filled with cheese and herbs near the hippodrome, wrote in his account book in the year 518 that business was always best on execution days. People had appetites, he noted in his cramped handwriting, especially after watching something that reminded them they were still alive. The sand of the arena floor was replaced every few weeks, carted away in wagons and dumped in a ravine outside the city walls. New sand, pale gold and fine as ground glass, would be spread smooth by slaves working through the night, so that each morning the hippodrome appeared fresh and innocent, ready to receive whatever the day would bring. The blood soaked into that sand quickly, leaving only dark patches that dried to the color of rust in the sun. Rain would wash some of it away, but not all. Never all. And now, as this chapter closes like a heavy door, as your thoughts begin to drift and scatter like those grains of sand on an ancient wind, let your mind float gently into the next chapter, where we'll discover what happened when spectacle became something even stranger, when the line between entertainment and nightmare blurred until no one could quite remember where one ended and the other began. There's something comfortingly methodical about the way empires keep records, even of their darkest moments. In the imperial archives of Constantinople, in the year 542, A scribe named Demetrios recorded the expenses for what was called the Great Purple Games, 3 days of spectacles ordered by Emperor Justinian to celebrate the completion of the Hagia Sophia, that vast church whose dome still seems to float impossibly above its walls, defying both gravity and good sense. Demetrios had beautiful handwriting, the kind that flows like water across parchment, each letter perfectly formed. He noted the cost of purple dye, extracted from thousands of murex snails and worth more than gold, used to color the silk drapes that hung around the imperial box. He recorded payments to animal trappers, to sword makers, to the families of slaves who died setting up the elaborate machinery required for the games. And in a margin note, written small as if he hoped no one would notice, he added that the whole affair had made him physically ill, that he had vomited twice while tallying the expenses for what he called the morning's unpleasantness. Let me tell you what that morning's unpleasantness entailed. The games began at dawn on a June day so hot that people in the stands fanned themselves with whatever came to hand: palm leaves, pieces of parchment, the hems of their own garments. Vendors moved through the crowd selling a sweet drink made from grape must and honey, chilled in underground cisterns and served in clay cups that you drank from and then dropped to shatter on the stone steps. It was called oinomally, and it tasted like sunlight turned liquid, like summer afternoons crystallized into something you could swallow. The recipe was simple but precise: 3 parts must to 1 part honey, with a splash of snow water if you could get it from the mountains, though most vendors cheated and just used very cold spring water instead. In the arena below, a wooden platform had been constructed, painted purple to match the imperial color, rising about 12 feet above the sand. On this platform stood 20 men and women, criminals, heretics, those who had spoken against the emperor or the church or both. They were chained at the ankles but not at the wrists, which gave them just enough freedom to be interesting. Below the platform, in a pit dug deep into the sand, were vipers. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, brought from the swamps and rocky hills around the city, writhing over each other in a mass that looked like the platform itself was alive, breathing. The concept was simple in that nightmares are simple. The platform would be gradually dismantled, board by slaves working with long poles, until the condemned had nowhere left to stand. They could jump into the pit voluntarily, which some did, preferring a quick end, or they could cling to the shrinking surface, to those last few boards, until gravity and exhaustion made the choice for them. The crowd loved it because it created suspense, because each person would react differently, because you could almost pretend it was theater, a performance, rather than 20 human beings dying in extended terror. One of the condemned was a woman named Theodora, not the empress, who shared the name, but a baker's widow who had been convicted of heresy for saying that she didn't believe Christ had been fully divine, only fully human and very wise. She was 47 years old and had made the most wonderful savory breads, long loaves studded with olives and rosemary, bread that you could tear apart with your hands and dip into olive oil until the oil ran down your wrists. She had fed half her neighborhood on these loaves, selling them cheaply to people who couldn't afford meat, and many of those same people were now in the stands, watching her die, because refusing to watch would have marked them as sympathizers. The first boards came away easily, pulled by slaves wearing leather gloves. The platform shrank. Some of the condemned began to pray, their voices carrying up to the stands in a ragged chorus. Others wept. Theodora stood very still, her hands clasped in front of her, and began to sing a hymn, not a Christian hymn, but something older, something that might have been sung in the temples before Christianity arrived. Her voice was surprisingly strong, surprisingly pure, and for a moment the crowd grew quieter, as if embarrassed by their own presence there. You might find this little detail strangely calming in its humanity. A man standing near Theodora, convicted of theft, pulled from his belt a small cloth bag containing dates stuffed with almond paste, an unusual snack he had been saving. As the platform shrank around them, as death became less abstract and more immediate, he offered these dates to the people standing near him. Some refused. Others took one, chewing slowly, tasting sweetness one last time. The dates had been prepared in the Persian style, each one carefully slit and the pit removed, replaced with a paste made from ground almonds and rosewater, then rolled in sesame seeds. They were called tamar mashi, and they had been a delicacy in Constantinople since the trade routes from the east had opened wider in the previous century. As your eyelids grow heavier, as the weight of sleep begins to press down on you like a gentle hand, picture how the sun moved across the hippodrome that morning, how the shadows of the colonnades swept slowly across the sand like the hands of an enormous clock. The dismantling took 3 hours. 3 hours of boards being removed, of the platform shrinking, of people making impossible choices or having those choices made for them by exhaustion and despair. Emperor Justinian watched from his kathisma, sitting beside Empress Theodora. The other Theodora, the Empress, who had once been an actress and dancer, who had performed in the very theaters that these spectacles mimicked. She ate preserved cherries throughout the morning, small dark fruits suspended in honey, one after another, spitting the pits into a silver bowl held by a servant. The cherries had been imported from Anatolia, from orchards in the mountains where the fruit grew small and intensely flavored. They were so expensive that only the imperial household could afford them outside of their brief growing season, and preserving them in honey was the only way to keep them from spoiling. The Empress's lips were stained dark red from the juice. Historical records indicate that Justinian appeared bored. He had been emperor since 527, and by 542 he had seen enough death that it no longer moved him. He was more interested in a theological dispute about the nature of Christ that his advisors had briefed him on that morning, and witnesses report that he spent much of the games dictating letters to a scribe who knelt beside his chair, trying to write while the crowd roared and screamed around them. The baker's widow, Theodora, was one of the last to fall. She had stopped singing after the first hour, conserving her strength, standing on a piece of platform no larger than a dining table, then a chair, then finally just a single plank. When that plank was pulled away, she fell without crying out, and the vipers surged over her like a wave. The crowd made a sound like wind through a forest, a servation of satisfaction and horror mixed together until you couldn't tell one from the other. Afterward, slaves used long rakes to pull the bodies from the pit. The vipers, sated and sluggish, were captured and returned to their cages to be used again in future games. The sand was raked smooth. The wooden platform's remains were carried away. By afternoon, chariot races resumed as if nothing had happened, and vendors sold grilled lamb skewers marinated in wine and cumin, savory and rich, and life continued because life always continues, indifferent to individual suffering in that terrible way that perhaps only history can fully reveal. A merchant named Nikolaus, who sold wine from his family's vineyard, wrote in his journal that night. The entry survives in a private collection, that he had made excellent profit that day but could not enjoy it, that the taste of wine had turned bitter in his mouth, that he wondered whether God watched these spectacles and, if so, what God thought of those who attended them voluntarily, who brought their children, who cheered. And now, as your breathing deepens into the rhythm of approaching sleep, as your consciousness begins to loosen its grip on the day, let the story carry you onward. Let it drift you toward the next chapter, where we'll explore how cruelty became ritual, how spectacle transformed into something that everyone agreed was necessary, until the day came when someone finally said it had gone too far. Allow your mind to settle now into the year 558, 16 years after the Purple Games, in a different season, winter, when Constantinople's streets ran with cold rain and the hippodrome's marble seats glistened with moisture that made them treacherous to climb. In a small house near the harbor of Julian, an old man named Marcus lay dying, attended by a priest who had known him for 40 years and who was about to hear a confession that would disturb his sleep for the rest of his life. Marcus had been the imperial beastmaster for 23 years, from 535 to 558, responsible for acquiring, training, and maintaining all the animals used in the hippodrome spectacles. He had started as an assistant to the previous beastmaster, had learned the trade from the ground up, which animals were most reliable, which were most dramatic, how to starve them just enough without killing them, how to transport them through city streets without causing panic, how to dispose of their bodies when they died of disease or injury or simple despair. Imagine the gentle sound of rain on roof tiles, the flicker of an oil lamp in the corner of Marcus's bedroom, the priest's soft breathing as he leaned close to hear the old man's words. Marcus told him everything that night, and the priest, a man named Stephanos, wrote it all down later in a private document that was discovered in a monastery library in the 19th century, carefully preserved between two pieces of cedar wood that had kept the moths away for 13 centuries. Let me share with you what Marcus confessed. He spoke first about a sweet he had loved as a child, before he had ever worked with animals or death. Pastili, a simple confection made from sesame seeds and honey, pressed into flat bars and cut into squares. His mother had made it every autumn, when honey was cheap and fresh from the final harvest of the year. The sesame seeds would be toasted first until they smelled nutty and warm, then mixed with hot honey and spread onto an oiled marble slab to cool. When it hardened, she would cut it with a knife dipped in cold water, and young Marcus would eat piece after piece until his stomach ached with sweetness. He told the priest that he couldn't remember the last time he had eaten pastili, that somewhere in the years of his work he had lost the ability to taste sweetness at all, that honey now tasted like nothing to him, like eating air. The confession turned darker. Marcus described a day in 547 when he had been ordered to produce a spectacle involving bears. The emperor wanted something special, something memorable, because foreign dignitaries were visiting from Persia and needed to be impressed with Byzantine power and sophistication. Marcus had acquired 12 bears from Thrace, enormous creatures with dark brown fur and small, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. The plan was to release the bears into the arena with 24 condemned criminals, but not all at once. The criminals would be released in pairs, every 5 minutes, so the bears would be continually engaged, continually aggressive. It was meant to last an hour, to build tension and release it repeatedly like a wave. Marcus had fed the bears nothing but raw meat for a week before, keeping them angry and hungry, conditioning them to associate the smell of human fear with food. You might find this detail soothingly mundane in its horror. Marcus spent 3 days before the event preparing special meals for the bears, chunks of mutton and pork seasoned with garum and black pepper, a savory preparation that sounds absurd until you realize he was trying to ensure the animals would be as vigorous as possible, as enthusiastic about their role. He treated it like cooking, like preparing a feast, which in a sense it was, only the feast was going to be people. The day arrived. The Persian dignitaries sat in the kathisma beside the emperor, eating sugared almonds and making polite conversation about trade routes and military alliances. The bears were released first, shaking their massive heads as they emerged from the darkness of the holding pens into the bright sand of the arena. Then the first 2 criminals, a man and a woman convicted of selling church property, were pushed through a gate on the opposite side. What happened next was not what anyone expected. The bears, confused by the noise of the crowd and the strange environment, did not attack. They milled around, sniffing the air, occasionally swatting at each other in what looked more like play than aggression. The criminals, seeing this, froze in place, perhaps hoping that stillness would save them. Minutes passed. The crowd grew restless. The emperor leaned over to Marcus, who was standing in the tunnel below the Kathisma, and said something that Marcus could not hear over the noise but understood perfectly from the emperor's expression. Marcus ordered his assistants to use long poles with sharpened tips to prod the bears from behind screens at the arena's edge. The bears roared and turned, but still did not attack the criminals. They seemed more interested in escaping back to their pens. One bear, the largest, actually approached the wooden barrier that separated the arena from the stands and reared up on its hind legs, placing its paws against the wood as if testing whether it could climb out. Children in the crowd squealed with delight and terror. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of this confusion, Marcus made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. He ordered his assistants to shoot the bears with arrows, not to kill them but to wound them, to drive them into such pain and fury that they would attack anything nearby. The assistants, hidden behind the screens, obeyed. Arrows flew. Bears screamed, and yes, that is the right word. They screamed in voices that sounded almost human. And then, finally, bleeding and crazed with pain, they attacked the criminals. The spectacle lasted another 40 minutes. It was judged a success. The Persian dignitaries complimented the emperor on his entertainment. Marcus received a bonus payment of 50 gold solidi, enough to buy a small house with a courtyard and a fig tree. He told the priest that he had spent the money on wine, drinking himself into oblivion for 3 straight days, and that even drunk he could hear the bears screaming, that the sound had lodged itself somewhere in his skull where wine could not reach it. As your body relaxes deeper into your bed, as the boundaries between waking and sleeping grow thinner and more permeable, consider how Marcus described the unusual snack he had developed a taste for in his later years: pickled quail eggs, tiny things no bigger than a grape, preserved in brine flavored with dill and coriander. He would eat them for breakfast, biting through the rubbery white to reach the crumbly yellow yolk, tasting salt and herbs and something else, something he described to the priest as the flavor of regret, though that might have been the fever talking. The eggs were a delicacy from Armenia, brought to Constantinople by traders who knew there was always a market for exotic foods in the capital. They kept for months in their brine, sitting in ceramic jars on shelves, waiting. Marcus told the priest about other spectacles, other animals, lions that refused to fight and had to be killed for their disobedience, wolves that turned on their handlers, an elephant brought at enormous expense from India that had to be executed when it trampled a trainer during rehearsals. He described the smell of the holding pens, the constant low growl of caged predators, the way the stone walls sweated in summer heat and echoed with sounds that kept the neighbors awake at night. He spoke about the criminals too, though he tried not to learn their names. Better to think of them as actors playing roles, as necessary components of the spectacle rather than as individuals with histories and families and favorite foods. But sometimes their names slipped through, carried by gossip from the guards or written on the tablets that recorded their crimes. And once you knew a name, Marcus said, it was harder to do what needed to be done, harder to remain professional and detached. The priest asked Marcus if he had ever tried to stop the spectacles, to refuse his role. Marcus laughed at this, a weak sound like cloth tearing. What would have been the point? If he refused, someone else would have taken his position. The spectacles would have continued. Only he would have suffered, would have lost his livelihood, perhaps would have ended up in the arena himself, feeding the animals he had once managed. The machine was too large for any one person to stop. You could only choose your place within it, and Marcus had chosen to be well paid rather than dead. In the year 551, Marcus received an order that even he found excessive, and this is recorded in his confession, confirmed by a marginal note in the official records. The emperor wanted a spectacle involving fire. Criminals would be chained to posts, and trained hunting dogs would be released, but the arena floor would be covered with oil that would then be ignited, creating a literal ring of fire through which the dogs would have to pass to reach their targets. The idea was to see whether the dogs' training would overcome their fear of flames. Marcus prepared everything as ordered. The oil was laid down in channels carved into the sand, creating a pattern like the spokes of a wheel. The posts were set up at the hub. 10 criminals were chained in place. The dogs were brought from the kennels, eager and whining with excitement. The crowd filled the stands, larger than usual because rumors of something extraordinary had spread through the city. And then, at the last moment, as the torchbearers approached to light the oil, Marcus found himself unable to give the final signal. He stood in the tunnel, his hand half raised, while assistants and officials waited for his command. The emperor watched from the kathisma. The crowd began to murmur with impatience. And Marcus simply stood there, paralyzed by something he could not name, not quite conscience, not quite courage, but something in between, something that said this was where the line needed to be drawn. An official pushed past him and gave the signal himself. The oil ignited with a whoosh of heat that could be felt even in the stands. The dogs refused to move forward, no matter how much their handlers shouted or prodded. The spectacle was a failure. Marcus was demoted, his salary cut, his reputation damaged. But the criminals, at least those 10 on that particular day, were led back to their cells and eventually executed in more traditional ways, with rope or blade, with their skin unburnt. And now, as sleep pulls you deeper, as your thoughts scatter like those sparks that must have risen from the burning oil, let your consciousness drift into the next chapter, where we will discover what happened when even the emperors began to wonder whether they had gone too far, when the very people who ordered these spectacles started to question the empire they were building on sand and blood. Picture a winter evening in the year 565, in the private chambers of the great palace, where Emperor Justinian sat alone. A rare thing for an emperor, to be alone, but he had dismissed his guards and servants and even his empress, telling them he needed to think, to pray, to wrestle with questions that felt suddenly too heavy to share. He was 83 years old, and he would be dead within months, though he did not know that yet. What he did know was that his back ached, his eyesight was failing, and his dreams had become terrible things that followed him into waking. Let me tell you about the room where he sat. It was not grand or throne-like, but almost humble. A small study with a desk of polished walnut, a single window looking out over the palace gardens, now bare in winter, and an oil lamp that cast more shadows than light. On the desk were several wax tablets covered with Justinian's own handwriting, notes to himself about theology and law and the administration of an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. And beside these tablets was a wooden bowl containing a sweet he had always loved, melomacarona, honey cookies soaked in honey syrup and sprinkled with chopped walnuts. They were a Christmas treat, traditionally, though Justinian ate them year-round, finding comfort in their dense sweetness, the way the honey soaked through the cookie until it was nearly falling apart, requiring you to eat it quickly before it dissolved in your fingers. He picked up one of these cookies now, brought it to his mouth, and found he could not eat it. The smell of honey made him feel ill. He set it back in the bowl and instead stared at the tablets before him, at notes he had written earlier that day about a theological question that had bothered him for years. If God was all-powerful and all-good, how could he permit suffering? It was an old question, asked by philosophers since before Christianity, but tonight it felt personal, urgent, because Justinian had spent 40 years creating suffering in God's name, justifying brutality as justice, and suddenly he was not sure whether God agreed. You might find this detail quietly fascinating. Justinian had been reviewing records of executions in the Hippodrome, going back through his entire reign, trying to calculate how many people had died for his entertainment and the entertainment of his subjects. His secretaries had provided scrolls listing dates and names and crimes, dry bureaucratic prose that catalogued horror with the same tone used for grain shipments or tax collections. The number, as best as he could determine, was somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people over 4 decades. Not counting those who died in the riots, the wars, the plagues, just those who died specifically in the arena for spectacle. 12,000. He wrote the number on a fresh wax tablet, stared at it, then scratched it out with the stylus's flat end, then wrote it again. 12,000 people who might have lived if he had simply said no, if he had ended the practice when he took the throne, if he had found some other way to demonstrate power and maintain order. 12,000 families destroyed, children orphaned, wives widowed, parents burying sons and daughters. As your breathing slows, as your heartbeat becomes a distant, gentle drum, imagine Justinian standing and walking to the window. The gardens below were empty, the fountains turned off for winter to prevent freezing. Moonlight made the stone paths look like rivers of mercury winding between bare rose bushes and dormant herb beds. In summer, those beds would be thick with basil and mint and oregano, and the kitchen slaves would harvest them for the savory dishes that Justinian preferred: roasted lamb with garlic and rosemary, fish baked in salt crust, lentil stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. He had always had a good appetite, had always enjoyed food more than most emperors did, finding pleasure in simple flavors that reminded him of his youth before power had complicated everything. Tonight, though, the thought of food made him weary. He was remembering a specific execution from the year 542, during the Purple Games that his scribes had recorded in such painstaking detail. A woman had been among the condemned, a heretic who claimed that God loved everyone equally, that there was no hierarchy of souls, that emperors and beggars were the same in divine eyes. Her name had been Maria, and she had run a small tavern that served an unusual snack: fried cheese cubes flavored with thyme and lemon, crispy on the outside and molten within, served on wooden skewers. People had loved her tavern, loved her food, loved her cheerful irreverence. When she was arrested for heresy, 300 people had signed a petition for her release, which had sealed her fate rather than saving her, because such popularity in opposition to church doctrine could not be tolerated. Justinian had watched her die in the viper pit. He had eaten his preserved cherries, conducted his business, dictated his letters, and had not thought of her again until tonight, 23 years later, when her face had appeared in his dreams with perfect clarity, asking him a question he could not remember upon waking, but whose emotional weight remained like a stone in his chest. The historical record shows that Justinian issued a decree the next day, in January of 565, ordering the cessation of animal executions in the hippodrome. It was a brief decree, only a few lines in the official chronicles, and it gave no explanation, no theological justification, no political reasoning. Simply, these spectacles will end. Criminals will be executed by traditional means, hanging, beheading, but there will be no more of what had been done before. The decree caused confusion. Officials asked for clarification. The Beastmaster, no longer Marcus, who had died years before, but his successor, requested guidance on what to do with the animals already in possession. The public seemed largely indifferent. By 565, the spectacles had become routine, almost boring, and many people preferred the chariot races anyway, which had drama without quite so much blood. But Justinian refused to elaborate. When his advisors pressed him, asking whether this was about cost or logistics or some new theological position. He simply said that he was old and tired and that some things were better left undone, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had said in his entire reign. Let your eyelids grow heavy now as I tell you about the meal Justinian ate that evening, after issuing his decree. He had requested something simple from the palace kitchens: bread and olive oil, a piece of grilled fish, some olives cured in brine with herbs. The fish was sea bream, caught that morning in the Bosporus, its flesh white and flaky, tasting of salt and cold water. The bread was sourdough, with a crust that shattered when he tore it, revealing a soft interior full of irregular holes. He ate slowly, deliberately, paying attention to each bite in a way he had not done for years, and he thought about all the meals that the people he had killed would never eat, all the simple pleasures they had been denied by his orders. His wife, Empress Theodora, the real Theodora, the powerful one, had died in 548, 17 years before this moment, and Justinian had never remarried. He had loved her in a way that emperors are not supposed to love their wives, as an equal, as someone whose judgment he trusted more than his own. She would have understood what he was feeling tonight, he thought. She had been an actress, had performed in those same arenas when they were used for theater rather than execution, had known what it was like to stand in the sand with thousands of eyes watching. She had always hated the spectacles, had argued against them, though quietly, privately, choosing her battles carefully. Justinian ate a handful of olives, spitting the pits into his palm and setting them aside on a small plate. These were thrums, olives from Crete, wrinkled and dark purple, cured in salt until they were almost leathery, intensely flavored, tasting like the sea and the earth combined. They were his favorite, had been since childhood, since before he had ever imagined becoming emperor, when he was just Petrus Sebaceus, a farmer's nephew from an insignificant village, eating olives that his aunt had cured in clay jars, sitting on a stone wall watching sheep graze on rocky hillsides. How had that boy become this? How had simple ambition and luck and the Byzantine political machine transformed someone who loved olives and bread into someone who had presided over 12,000 deaths? Justinian did not know, could not trace the steps clearly, could only feel the weight of the distance between who he had been and who he had become. The decree held, though Justinian died in November of 565, 10 months after issuing it. His successor, Justin II, briefly considered rescinding it. The treasury could use the revenue from the spectacles, and the public might enjoy the entertainment, but something in Justinian's final wishes, documented in letters to the church, made Justin hesitate. The spectacles remained ended, and though public executions continued in other forms, the particular brutality of the arena deaths faded into memory, becoming history rather than practice. And now, as your consciousness drifts like smoke from a snuffed candle, As the boundary between this story and your dreams grows thin and permeable, let yourself float gently into the next chapter, where we will discover what happened to the memory of these spectacles, how they were remembered and forgotten and remembered again, how history preserves even what we wish it would not. Allow yourself to settle into the year 580, 15 years after Justinian's death, in a monastery outside Constantinople called the Monastery of Staudios. In a small cell with stone walls and a narrow window, a monk named Georgios sat at a writing desk, a quill in his hand and a massive chronicle spread before him in sections, dozens of parchment sheets covered with text, the work of 3 years, an attempt to document the reign of Justinian from birth to death, every significant event, every decree, every victory and defeat. Imagine the soft scratch of the quill on parchment, the smell of oak gall ink, slightly metallic and sharp. Outside the window, autumn had painted the monastery's orchard in shades of gold and amber, and the sound of brothers chanting vespers drifted up from the church below, a low murmur of Latin syllables that rose and fell like breathing. Georgios had been a historian before he had been a monk, had spent 20 years in the imperial library reading everything he could find about emperors and wars and the mechanisms of power. He had entered the monastery at 50, seeking peace and perhaps forgiveness for having spent so much of his life fascinated by violence. Now he faced a problem. His chronicle was nearly complete, but there was a section he had been avoiding, a chapter he knew he needed to write but could not quite bring himself to begin. The spectacles, the executions, the entertainment that had defined so much of Justinian's reign and had ended so abruptly, so mysteriously, in his final year. Georgios had been to the hippodrome many times, had watched criminals die, had been part of the crowd that roared and cheered and then went home to eat dinner and tuck children into bed. And now he had to write about it, had to make sense of it for future generations who would read his chronicle and try to understand what Byzantium had been. Let me tell you about the sweet that Georgios kept on his desk while he worked. A simple preparation of dried figs stuffed with crushed walnuts and honey, each fig rolled in sesame seeds until it looked like a small precious stone. These were a monastic specialty, made by the brothers who tended the orchard, and they were particularly good in autumn when the figs were fresh from the trees. The combination of figs' subtle sweetness, walnuts' earthy bitterness, and honey's floral notes created something greater than the sum of its parts. Georgios would eat one every hour or so, a small reward for producing another page of text, a way of marking time's passage in the silence of his cell. He picked up one of these figs now, turned it over in his fingers, and remembered a day 30 years before when he had been in the hippodrome watching a man being torn apart by dogs. The detail he remembered most clearly was not the violence but something else. A child sitting near him in the stands, maybe 7 years old, eating grilled squid on a stick, the savory smell of the seafood mixing with the copper smell of blood from the arena. The child had watched the execution with the same calm expression he might have used while watching clouds pass overhead, occasionally taking a bite of squid, chewing slowly, his legs swinging over the edge of the stone seat because his feet couldn't reach the ground. That child had not been born evil. He had simply been born into a world where such sights were normal, where entertainment and cruelty had become so intertwined that no one questioned the connection. And now Georgios had to write about that world without condemning everyone in it, without condemning himself, while also being honest about what it had been. You might find this small detail unexpectedly moving. Georgios wrote and rewrote his opening sentence for the Spectacle chapter 17 times. The discarded attempts survive on separate pieces of parchment that were found tucked into the Chronicles binding during a restoration in the 14th century. Each attempt tried to balance truth and compassion, accuracy and mercy. In the reign of Justinian, criminals were executed in the hippodrome in ways that, no, that was too passive. Emperor Justinian permitted spectacles of great cruelty. No, that placed too much blame on one man. The people of Constantinople gathered to watch. No, that spreads the blame too wide, making everyone guilty and therefore no one responsible. As your breathing deepens into the rhythm of sleep, as your body becomes heavier and more distant, picture Georgios finally settling on a version that satisfied him, or at least satisfied him enough to move forward. In these years, the ancient custom of public execution in the arena reached a form that many came to question, until the emperor himself, in his final year, decreed its end. Not perfect but honest. Acknowledging the practice without sensationalizing it, noting its termination without glorifying Justinian for ending something he had permitted to continue for 40 years. The chapter took Georgios 2 months to write, working slowly, checking every fact against the official records that the monastery library had acquired from the imperial archives. He documented the types of animals used, the crimes that warranted arena execution, the procedures and protocols. He included the story of Marcus the Beastmaster, whose confession had been copied and shared among religious houses as a cautionary tale about the price of complicity. He noted the cost in imperial solidi, the number of animals killed, the protests that occasionally arose and were quickly suppressed. And he included something else, something that no official record mentioned. The food. The vendors and their carts, the snacks that people ate while watching others die. This might seem trivial, he wrote in a marginal note, but food is memory, and memory is how we understand who we were. He listed everything he could remember or verify through conversations with other former spectators. The honeyed wine, the grilled lamb, the sweet pastries, the savory breads, the unusual delicacies like garum honey mixture and fried cheese cubes. One food in particular caught his attention, a snack called kaliva, made from boiled wheat mixed with pomegranate seeds, raisins, and powdered sugar, typically served at funerals as a memorial food. And yet vendors had sold it at the hippodrome, and people had eaten it during executions, creating a bizarre connection between mourning ritual and entertainment. Georgios tried to understand this, to find some explanation that made sense. Was it unconscious guilt? Dark humor? Simple entrepreneurship by vendors who knew that memorial foods were associated with death and therefore appropriate to the context? He never reached a satisfactory conclusion, but he documented the fact, trusting that future readers might understand what he could not. The historical record shows that Georgios's chronicle was copied and distributed widely, becoming one of the primary sources for Justinian's reign. It was translated into Latin, Armenian, Arabic, and eventually into modern languages. Scholars cite it still, praising its thoroughness and its unusual attention to daily life details that other chronicles ignored. And every historian who has worked with Georgios's text has noticed the same thing. The spectacle chapter is written in different ink than the surrounding pages, suggesting that Georgios returned to it multiple times, adding details, revising phrases, unable to leave it alone even after he thought it was finished. Let your mind drift now as I tell you about the meal Georgios ate the night he finally completed that chapter. The monastery refectory served a simple supper: lentil soup with bread, olives, a small piece of cheese, and water to drink. But the brother who served Georgios that night, a young man named Andreas who knew that Georgios had been struggling with difficult work, had saved something special from the kitchen stores. A small portion of pastourma, dried cured beef rubbed with a paste of garlic, cumin, and fenugreek, sliced paper-thin, intensely flavored. It was a treat normally reserved for feast days, expensive because the preparation took weeks and required skill to prevent spoilage. Georgios ate it slowly, letting each slice dissolve on his tongue, tasting the spices and the deep, almost wild flavor of the aged meat. It was savory in a way that felt ancient, connecting him to every person who had ever preserved meat for winter, every culture that had learned to transform fresh food into something that could survive time. And he thought about preservation of a different kind, about the work he had done, trying to preserve memory in ink and parchment, trying to ensure that future generations would know what had happened, would have the chance to learn from Byzantium's mistakes or at least to understand them. After dinner, Georgios returned to his cell and added one final note to the spectacle chapter, a personal reflection that broke the historical chronicle's formal tone. I write this as one who watched and did nothing, who cannot claim innocence because silence is participation. May those who read these words judge us as we deserve, and may that judgment bring wisdom. The abbot, reading the chronicle before authorizing its copying, considered removing this note as too personal, too self-indulgent. But something made him leave it in, and so it survives, a small window into the mind of a man trying to make sense of his own complicity, his own humanity, his own failure and the failures of his civilization. And now, as sleep pulls you deeper, as the story becomes dream and dream becomes the formless space before morning, let yourself float into the final chapter, where we will discover how memory itself can be a kind of spectacle, how the act of remembering can be both burden and gift, and how the past never really ends but only changes its costume and returns to the stage again and again. Rest now in the year 1204, more than 6 centuries after Justinian's death, in a Constantinople that is burning. The Fourth Crusade has arrived, though it was supposed to be going to Egypt, supposed to be fighting Muslims, but circumstances and debts and the terrible logic of violence have redirected it here, to the Christian capital of the Christian East, and now Western knights are pillaging the richest city in Christendom while the world watches in shock. In a small house near the Hippodrome, yes, the Hippodrome still stands, has stood through centuries, though its animals and executions ended long ago. A scholar named Constantine huddles with his family in a cellar, listening to the sounds of destruction above. Boots on cobblestones, crashes of breaking doors, screams that echo through streets that had once been called the most civilized on earth. Constantine is 62 years old, a professor of rhetoric at what remains of the Imperial University, and he clutches against his chest a leather satchel containing manuscripts, including a copy of Gorgias's Chronicle, along with his own writings about the history of the Hippodrome. Let me tell you what Constantine is thinking as he sits in that dark cellar, his wife beside him, his adult son standing near the narrow steps with a knife he will probably not know how to use if soldiers descend. He is thinking about cycles, about how history repeats not exactly but rhythmically, how the spectacles of Justinian's time were themselves echoes of older Roman practices, and how the violence happening now above his head is another echo, another instance of entertainment becoming cruelty, of crowds gathering to watch suffering because somehow watching makes the watchers feel more alive. The satchel contains something else, a small wooden box holding a piece of baklava that Constantine's wife had made 3 days before the city fell, when they still believed the walls would hold. Baklava, layers of thin pastry brushed with butter, filled with crushed pistachios and walnuts, soaked in honey syrup flavored with rosewater and lemon. It had been a celebration dish, made because their daughter had gotten engaged, because life had seemed good and future-oriented. Now that future had collapsed, and the baklava sat in its box, somehow miraculous for having survived catastrophe, sweet and fragile and completely useless. Constantine's son, Alexios, whispers down from the steps that the sounds seem to be moving away, heading toward the palace district where the real treasures are. Perhaps they will survive. Perhaps the soldiers will miss this modest house with its cellar entrance hidden behind a false wall in the kitchen. As your consciousness drifts into deeper rest, As the line between my voice and silence grows increasingly thin, imagine that waiting, that suspension between one moment and the next, when everything depends on whether boots turn left or right at an intersection you cannot see. Hours pass. The sounds do fade. By dawn, the immediate danger seems to have moved elsewhere, though the city still burns in patches, smoke rising like prayers that no one will answer. Constantine and his family emerge from the cellar, cautious, moving through rooms that have been ransacked but not destroyed. Soldiers had come through quickly, finding little of value, taking what metal they could carry and moving on to richer targets. The first thing Constantine does, after confirming his family's safety, is check his satchel. The manuscripts are intact. The wooden box is intact. He opens it and stares at the baklava, somehow still perfect, its layers visible where he had cut it into diamond shapes, its surface glistening with syrup. And he makes a decision that his wife thinks is madness. He takes the baklava outside, walks through dangerous streets to the hippodrome, and sits on the stone steps where spectators once sat, and he eats it. You might find this detail oddly beautiful. Constantine, sitting in the ruins of his burning city, eating wedding sweets and reading from Gorgias's chronicle, specifically reading the chapter about the spectacles, about the cruelties that had unfolded in this very space 600 years before. He reads about the viper pit, about Marcus the Beastmaster, about Justinian's final decree. And he thinks about how the Crusaders are writing their own chronicle right now with fire and sword, how some scholar 600 years in the future will sit in his own ruins reading about this moment, trying to understand how Christians could do this to Christians, how entertainment could become horror, how the line between civilization and barbarism was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The baklava is delicious, honey and nuts and buttery pastry, each bite a small perfection that seems to exist outside of time, outside of history, a pure moment of sweetness that the world cannot touch. Constantine eats slowly, making it last, and he cries while eating, which ruins the taste a little, salt mixing with sweet, but that seems appropriate somehow. Historical records confirm that Constantine survived the sack of Constantinople. His manuscripts survived too, eventually making their way to a monastery on Mount Athos, where they were preserved through more centuries of violence and change. Gorgias's chronicle, including Constantine's annotations, he had written notes in the margins during that morning in the hippodrome, thoughts about memory and repetition, became one of the key sources for understanding Byzantine culture, studied by scholars who would never taste baklava in ruins but could imagine it, could feel across the gulf of time some echo of what Constantine had felt. Let your breathing slow now. Let your heartbeat become a distant drum as I tell you about what happened to the hippodrome itself. It continued to stand for centuries more, through Ottoman conquest and renovation, through earthquakes and fires, through the slow transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul. The arena floor where criminals had died was buried under new construction, under streets and buildings and the forward march of urban life. But pieces remain, obelisks, columns, architectural fragments scattered through the modern city like memories that refuse to be forgotten. And the practice itself, the spectacle of public execution as entertainment, it did not end with Justinian's decree. It transformed, moved to new locations, new forms. Every culture has found its own way to turn suffering into spectacle, to gather crowds and sell snacks and pretend that watching is somehow different from participating. Constantine understood this, sitting in the Hippodrome in 1204, and we understood it too, though we pretend we don't, though we tell ourselves our entertainments are different, more civilized, less cruel. The wooden box that had held Constantine's baklava was found by archaeologists in 1967 during excavations near the Hippodrome. It was empty, of course, broken into pieces, but it still smelled faintly of honey, or so the excavation report claims, though that might have been imagination, the power of suggestion, the way we project our desires onto silent objects. The box is in a museum now, in a glass case with a placard explaining its probable origin and use, another fragment of a story that can never be fully told. As sleep takes you completely now, as your consciousness dissolves into dreams that need no narrative, no logic, no history except what you create in the moment, let me leave you with one final image. Imagine a vendor in the Hippodrome in the year 540, selling his savory pies filled with cheese and herbs. Imagine him packing up at the end of the day, counting his coins, satisfied with his profit. He walks home through streets that smell of cooking fires and sewage and flowers, past churches and bathhouses and shops closing for the night. He reaches his small apartment, kisses his wife, picks up his daughter and spins her around until she squeals with laughter. He eats dinner, lentil soup, bread, olives, simple things. He tells his wife about his day, about the good business, about the execution he barely noticed because he had seen so many. He goes to bed and sleeps well, dreamlessly, his conscience clear because he is just a vendor, just a man trying to feed his family, not responsible for anything except his pies and his prices. And now he is gone, and his wife is gone, and his daughter is gone, and everyone who ate his pies is gone, and even the memory of his pies is gone except for this moment, this telling, this attempt to grasp something that history recorded in margins and accidents and the slow accumulation of detail that somehow adds up to a life, to thousands of lives, to a civilization that thought itself eternal and was wrong. May these soft memories guide you into peaceful dreams, dreams that require nothing from you except surrender, except the willingness to let go of the day and all its weight. The past is behind us, but it is also always present, always echoing, always whispering in languages we almost remember. Sleep now, knowing that morning will come, that history continues whether we watch or not, that cruelty and kindness both persist in their ancient dance, and that somewhere, always, someone is eating something sweet and thinking about what it all means. Thank you for traveling through this gentle piece of history with me, for letting my voice guide you through shadows and firelight, through marble corridors and sand-strewn arenas, through centuries that feel both distant and intimately close. If you drifted into peaceful sleep somewhere along the way, if you found rest in these stories of our shared human past, let me know in the comments when you wake. Tell me where you stopped remembering, where the boundary between history and dream became too thin to navigate. Or don't. Sleep is enough, always enough. Sweet dreams, my friends. Until we meet again in that quiet space between stories, where all histories dissolve into the same soft silence that holds us now. Rest well. Rest deep. Let the world turn without you for a while, knowing it will still be here when you return. Good night.